The Warden, chapters 1 to 11. Publication. Anthony Trollope began writing his fourth novel on the 29th of July, 1853, when staying in Tenbury near Worcester with his wife Rose on their return to England from their first visit to his brother Tom and wife Theodosia in their villa in Florence. A year earlier, while working in Salisbury as a surveyor for the post office, he had conceived the idea and setting of the story, as I shall focus on later. But almost immediately after starting to write, his employers summoned him to take up the post of acting surveyor to the North District of Ireland based in Belfast, which proved so demanding it prevented him from taking up the novel until the end of the year. In October 1854, he sent it to the publisher Longman, whose reader sent Trollope a very favourable report. While the subject was not promising, quote, "The author has contrived to weave out of his materials an amusing and very interesting tale. The characters are well drawn and happily distinguished, and the whole story is pervaded by a vein of quiet humour and good-natured satire," end quote. The Warden was published in January 1855. Although the reader thought it would have a large sale, fewer than 400 of the printed copies were sold in the first half year. Trollope commented in his autobiography, "The novel reading public did not go mad about the Warden, but I soon felt that it had not failed as the others had failed." I have read the novel a few times, but until acquiring the World's Classics edition, only superficially, as Nicholas Shrimpton puts it in his revelatory introduction. Cosy and charming, a touching, romantic comedy that invites us to eavesdrop on the personal and moral dilemmas of a group of sharply observed but fundamentally sympathetic group of characters. Henry James called it delicate and delightful, rather like many diminish the works of Jane Austen. Condition of England novels. I hadn't thought of the Warden as in the vogue of Condition of England novels of the mid-19th century, or that Dickens's Hard Times and Bleak House were published during the 3 years while Trollope was mulling over and writing his experimental novel, as Shrimpton says, quote, "anxiously searching for an appropriate model for successful prose fiction," end quote. After 2 Irish novels and an equally unsuccessful attempt at a historical narrative and play. Do read his introduction's explanation of the Warden's political and social context and the informative appendix on the Church of England in Trollope's time, which shows it not ailing and out of kilter in a secular and hostile society, but confident, vigorous, and dynamic. Shrimpton shows how the issues of the Warden were regarded as seriously in contemporary debate as the conditions for workers in factories and mines or agriculture. On the 22nd of October 1852, a leader in the Times thundered, "The abuses of cathedral trusts will henceforth become one of the great questions of the day, which can no longer be shirked or evaded." Compared with the writers of other contemporary Condition of England novels, say Dickens in Hard Times, with his tendency to caricature and oversimplification, the Warden is, Shrimpton says, quote, "enriched to an exceptional degree with social and psychological interest. It combines a serious treatment of urgent contemporary issues with a complex realism of character and setting, which will be the defining feature of the subsequent novels in the Barsetshire series." The influence of the press, especially the leaders of the Jupiter, also known as the Times, has cropped up in a conversation in a novel written a dozen years later and recently completed by ourselves. A barrister's profession is regarded as a profession among gentlemen, Mr. Stanbury, and is not ours recognised. Which of us, barristers or men of literature, have the most effect on the world at large? Who is most thought of in London, Sir Marmaduke, the Lord Chancellor, or the editor of the Jupiter? Chapter 71 of He Knew He Was Right. The details of the dispute over the hospital in Barchester were based on the hospital at St. Cross in Winchester. A reformer, a clergyman rather than a doctor as in the novel, became obsessed with the alleged abuse of the hospital's funds in Winchester and took it to the press, the Attorney General, and Parliament. The case was being dragged through the courts and reported in the Times just as Trollope was writing The Warden, where mention is made of it. The preeminence of the Times in the campaign against perceived corruption in the Anglican hierarchy is described vividly by Nicholas Shrimpton. Originally, medieval charities or trusts were set up to provide a home for the deserving poor, and to give them, in addition to food and lodging, so much a day or week. The rest of the income from the trust, mainly derived from land and property, went towards the upkeep of the buildings and the warden's stipend. Over hundreds of years, the income of the recipients, also known as beadsmen, did not change very much. What really rose was the warden's stipend as the value of the trust increased. Trollope made this the central issue in The Warden. Plot and character. Henry James summed up the plot of The Warden as simply the history of an old man's conscience. The opening page introduces the Reverend Septimus Harding, an elderly widower in the tale's quiet cathedral town setting in southwest England, quote, more remarkable for the beauty of its cathedral and the antiquity of its monuments than any commercial prosperity, end quote. He has lived an easy life there for most of his career as a minor canon on a modest stipend, indulging his fine voice and taste for sacred music, and playing his beloved cello. When his beautiful elder daughter Susan married the archdeacon's son of the bishop, Mr. Harding remained with his younger daughter Eleanor and was promoted at 50 to precentor in charge of the cathedral's music, and also appointed to another post in the gift of the bishop, the warden of Hiram's Hospital, an almshouse for 12 elderly male retainers of the cathedral estate, a sinecure raising his income to a very comfortable £800 in contrast with the beadsman's pittance. However, he increases their allowance from his own pocket, making him popular in the town, but this seriously dissatisfied his strong-minded son-in-law, the Archdeacon, Dr. Theophilus Grantley, the man of whom alone Mr. Harding stood in awe, who urgently, nay, vehemently, opposed so impolitic a concession. It's no surprise that, being of so kindly and generous a disposition, not only to the old men, but providing his 24-year-old younger daughter Eleanor with her own carriage and ponies, that his bullying superior allows no extravagances to escape him, and now Mr. Harding is more or less in debt to his son-in-law. John Bold, 2 generations younger than Septimus, has similarly been made rich through the inheritance of property, and shares his generosity, practicing medicine among the poor free of charge, and they have become friends. John is the same age as Eleanor and in love with her, but he is a radical and zealous reformer of state and church abuses, so we can expect conflict with the Archdeacon, set off by the aptly named Bold, starting legal inquiries into the financial basis of Hiram's Hospital. 10 years since chapter 1, the murmurs are again becoming audible through cases such as Old Cross Hospital in Winchester of grasping priests gorged with the wealth which the charity of former times has left for the solace of the old, being raised by pushing politicians in the House of Commons and the press, led by the Jupiter. When asked by Bold about the terms of Hiram's will, he pleads ignorance, but is upset by the fear that he might be in the wrong in accepting a salary which ought to be distributed among more needy recipients, and also by the knowledge of the romantic attraction between Bold and Eleanor. No joy comes from consulting his old friend the supine bishop, who refers him to his belligerent son. But he has already taken up arms prominently against the reformers in publications supporting the establishment, is regarded as a tower of strength. Dr. Grantley had a holy horror of the impious demagogue. He did not believe in the gospel with more assurance than he did in the sacred justice of all ecclesiastical revenues. Trollope comments, I fear that John Bold, while thoroughly sincere in his patriotic endeavours to mend mankind, is too much imbued with the idea that he has a special mission for reforming. It would be well if one so young had a little more diffidence himself and more trust in the honest purposes of others, if he could be brought to believe that old customs need not necessarily be evil, and that changes may possibly be dangerous. But no wonder that Dr. Grantley should regard Bold as a firebrand, falling as he has done in the centre of the quiet ancient close of Barchester Cathedral. They're somewhat alike. The Archdeacon, while diligent and authoritative, his great fault was an overbearing assurance of the virtues and claims of his order, and his great foible an equally strong confidence in the dignity of his own manner and the eloquence of his own words. Such a work required no ordinary vigour, and the Archdeacon was therefore extraordinarily vigorous. It demanded a buoyant courage and a heart happy in his toil, and the Archdeacon's heart was happy and his courage was buoyant. Within 10 pages, we know the constituent parts of the plot and its drama. Trollope's experience of writing 3 novels and a play, while commercially unsuccessful, informs his assurance in creating parallels in opposition of characters that can be rich in comedy and dramatic irony. Other characters and their relation to the central conflict open up its perspectives. John Bold is troubled by having to introduce a theme of so much discord to disturb the peace of him who was so ready to welcome him kindly. Eleanor, in love with her father's friend, so brave, eager, and amusing, well-made and good-looking, cannot bear anyone speaking harshly of him, so begins to greatly dislike the Archdeacon, though, like her father, she's somewhat afraid of that sonorous tone and lofty deportment which strikes awe into the young hearts of Barchester. The bishop and Mr. Harding loved each other warmly. They had grown old together and had together spent many, many hours in clerical pursuits and clerical conversation. I will not say that they managed the diocese between them, but they spent much time in discussing the man who did. Even Eleanor's down-to-earth and practical sister, Mrs. Grantley, never assumed a more familiar term than Archdeacon when addressing him. She is introduced as his all-trusted helpmate, with mock heroic commentary and broad comedy reminiscent of Fielding and Tom Jones, in that sainted enclosure of the clerical bed curtains. Her common sense causing the expostulating husband to be at a loss for words other than "Good heavens," as she closes the conversation by turning under the bedclothes. Mr. Bunce, the pride of the hospital, affectionately regarded by Mr. Harding as his sub-warden, had assumed and knew well how to maintain the dignity of his elevation, just like the Archdeacon. And not even Dr. Grantley had a more holy horror of those who would interfere in the affairs of the hospital. The 12 occupants are divided over the issue of what they are led to believe is their rightful inheritance of £100 a year for each man. But eventually 9 of them put their names to a petition defying their leader, Bunce, who is, like Grantley and Bold, disgusted at the frailty of human nature. Their debate demonstrates Trollope's skill in offsetting a variety of individuals and attitudes in dramatically assured dialogue, exposing also the poignancy of their situation, underlined by his comments showing his empathy and compassion. Poor old men, Whoever may be righted or wronged by this inquiry, they at any rate will assuredly be only injured. To them it can only be an unmixed evil. How can their lot be improved? All their wants are supplied, every comfort is administered, they have warm houses, good clothes, plentiful diet, and rest after a life of labour. And above all, that treasure so inestimable in declining years, watch over their sickness and administer comfort as regards this world and the world to come. Chapter 4. However, the dispute becomes public and is elevated by the Jupiter into a conflict between church and state, so as taken out of the control of any of the participants. The archdeacons lecturing the men about their petition only hardens their antagonism. The legal opinion of Sir Abraham Haphazard that there are weaknesses in the legal documents Dr. Grantley assumes to be favourable to his case, clearing his father-in-law of any blame, but his insistence that they are kept secret deeply troubles the warden, to the extent that he considers resigning. The archdeacon bullies him in the name of the larger good of the church, but this leaves him despondent, seeing his reputation and way of life in ruins. Increasingly concerned for her father's mental health, Eleanor encourages him to give everything up and live in an untroubled state of simplicity, and appeals to John Bold to leave the case alone, which he does out of his declared love for her. We have reached the story's emotional turning point, as both Harding and Bold confront the actions that their consciences demand. Trollope's empathy with Harding's reaction to the crisis that rocks his erstwhile tranquil life and unquestioning compliance, and the parallel dilemma for John Bold's civic duty conflicting with that of a prospective son-in-law, with the diverse reactions of Eleanor and the Grantleys and the old bishop, turn a social issue into a comic yet poignant drama that we see kindles the author's imagination as the story takes off in these chapters. Having recently read some of Trollope's later works, we are in an excellent position to reflect on his already evident skill in dramatizing social and political issues dominating the era in which the novel was written, which I hope we can discuss in these sessions. Typically, Trollope saw both sides of the question. He himself supported reform, but disliked reformers. In chapter 5, he surmises that even the great reformers would relent were they to, quote, allow themselves to stroll by moonlight round the towers of some of our ancient churches. Who would not feel charity for a prebendary when walking the quiet length of that long aisle at Winchester, looking at those decent houses, that trim grass plot, and feeling as one must the solemn, orderly comfort of the spot? Who could be hard upon a dean while walking round the sweet close of Hereford, and owning that in that precinct, tone and colour, design and form, solemn tower and storied window are all in unison, perfect? Who could like basking in the cloisters of Salisbury and gaze on Jewell's library and that unequalled spire without feeling that bishops should sometimes be rich? Barsetshire. We read The Warden now as a prequel to a series of 5 much longer stories written over 12 years known as the Chronicles of Barsetshire. Victoria Glendenning in her biography must be thinking of Septimus Harding's love of playing the cello, called by Trollope the saddest of instruments, when she writes, "The Warden is like a musical theme played on a solo violoncello at the beginning of a concerto. The simple arrangement of notes is the beginning of the whole. No one hearing the theme for the first time has any notion of the variations and developments, the changes in mood, pace, and dynamics, or the complexity of texture that would come with a complete orchestral work." Barsetshire and its inhabitants have lodged in the popular literary imagination alongside another recreation of this region of England, Thomas Hardy's Wessex. However, while you can trace its towns and villages on an Ordnance Survey map of the region, you can't do likewise with Barsetshire. When I was teaching in Dorset, a Thomas Hardy novel was obligatory in the English department curriculum. A-level students responded to tests of the d'Urbervilles with localized enthusiasm, identifying with its setting, nicknaming one of the class Tess because she lived in a cottage identified as being the model for Hardy's heroine's home. I hope she had a happier fate. I recently returned to Hardy's Wessex to live in Melchester, also known as Salisbury, which features in Jude the Obscure. In the close of the cathedral, the Salisbury Museum is housed in the building of the Teachers' Training College, where Thomas Hardy's sisters were students. But I can't claim to live in Barchester, not least because, as we know from a recent big read in the Eustace Diamond, Salisbury becomes Bobsborough. In the mid-20th century, Angela Thirkell made a living with a series of 30 romantic comedies set in contemporary Barsetshire, where the descendants of 100 years before have kept their homes and names, like Greshamsbury and Plumstead, with Trollopian in-jokes like Dean Crawley and the prize bulls reared in Rushwater. In the 1945 story Peace Breaks Out, Thirkell imagines an, quote, exquisite prospect of Barsetshire from a hilltop view, affecting impressionable 19-year-old Anne with a delightful sense of romantic melancholy, of looking on happy autumn fields and thinking of days that were no more, and she could have cried with the greatest pleasure. To the north the downs rolled away, one green humped bulk behind another, where sheep bells rang. To the east and southeast were glimpses of arable land now turning golden. To the west and southwest lay the green water meadows bordering the river rising, then the roofs and towers of Barchester, crowned by its soaring steeple. Hey, what steeple? Surely not the 404 feet spire of Salisbury that the poisoners of the Skripals claimed attracted them to travel here from Russia 3 years ago. The title of the next story in the Chronicle refers to the towers of Barchester's cathedral. Through his mother, Anthony Trollope had strong West Country connections. He knew Barsetshire from his earliest days. There were old family friends and relations around Bristol. A favourite cousin, Fanny Bent, lived in Exeter, and the young Trollopes visited her on West Country holidays, a strong-minded, unmarried woman with reactionary opinions, also known to us as Jemima Stanbury. Trollope recalls as well known in Exeter as the cathedral's unusual 2 towers. Staying with Fanny Bent in the Cathedral Close was Anthony's first experience of the small, self-contained world of a cathedral city. 30 years after writing The Warden, he said Barsetshire was Somerset. The interior of the cathedral resembles that of Wells, while the city and cathedral were based on Winchester, where he was at school. At the foot of St. Catherine's Hill runs the River Itchen, where the boys swam in summer. In the water meadows beside the Itchen is the Hospital of St. Cross, an almshouse for 13 poor men, the memory of which gave Anthony a model for Hiram's Hospital in The Warden. The close at Winchester, to which the college seems to belong, became as familiar as Exeter's with a family friend who was a prebendary of the cathedral, keeping in touch until the 1870s. All of these places merged in Trollope's imagination, as he says in the Warden's opening paragraph, to give anonymity to the characters of the cathedral dignitaries and protect the innocent. Salisbury and the Warden. Salisbury does have a documented claim to the novel's inception. In his day job of surveying and mapping postal routes across the West Country from Cornwall to South Wales on horseback, covering 40 miles a day, on the 22nd of May, 1852, he was working here. While wandering one warm evening round the cathedral close, he stood for an hour on the Harnham Bridge on the London road over the River Avon by St. Nicholas's Hospital, and conceived the story from which came that series of novels of which Barchester, with its bishops, deans, and archdeacon, was the central site. This is how the hospital looked 60 years later in 1913 and today. Lecture to the SCCPS. Trollope wrote in his autobiography, I may as well declare at once that no one at their commencement could have had less reason than myself to presume himself to be able to write about clergymen. I've been asked in what period of my early life I had lived so long in a cathedral city as to have become intimate with the ways of a close. My archdeacon, who has been said to be lifelike, and to whom I confess that I have all a parent's fond affection, was, I think, the simple result of an effort of my moral consciousness. It was such as that, in my opinion, an archdeacon should be, or at least, anyway, would be, with such advantages as an archdeacon might have. And lo, an archdeacon was produced, who has been declared by competent authorities to be a real archdeacon down to the very ground. And yet, as far as I can remember, I had not then even spoken to an archdeacon. I felt the compliment to be very great. In 2006, the distinguished Trolopian Pamela Neville Singleton, since deceased, gave the annual lecture to the Salisbury Cathedral Close Preservation Society. She questioned this claim. Quote, "This is simply not true. As a child, he would have known the two cathedral towns of Exeter and Winchester. Both his grandfathers were clergymen, and while at Harrow, his family, especially his mother Fanny, had an open feud with the evangelical Reverend John Cunningham. In 1837, Fanny published a novel, The Vicar of Wrexhill, one of her most popular, about the Reverend William Cartwright, an unctuous evangelical clergyman greedy for power based on their Harrow neighbour. Both the real Cunningham and fictional Cartwright were clearly models for the infamous Obadiah Slope in Anthony's Barchester Towers. Fanny based another of the novels, Petticoat Government in the Cathedral Town. This Trolopian world of the Cathedral Close was his mother's domain before him. As one critic noted, the English clergy, from the poor country curate to haughty, dictatorial, heartless bishops and preferment-seeking rectors, had long been considered Fanny's province. Anthony had been avoiding writing about what he knew so well, because it would have begged comparison with his mother's novels, and she was still churning out bestsellers in the early 1850s. This is why Anthony's first novels were set in Ireland and in 18th century France, anywhere but in the world of English manners, because that territory belonged to his mother. But in Salisbury, that midsummer evening in 1852, Neville Singleton concludes, he finally accepted his inheritance, as it were, and the Warden was the beginning of his success as a writer. A view from the bridge. We left the post office surveyor come as yet unsuccessful young novelist musing on the bridge adjoining the pretty garden of St. Nicholas's Hospital, an almshouse with 6 brothers and 6 sisters, a master and a chaplain. It is now a hospice still linked to the cathedral with a chaplain. I read in the local history section of Salisbury Library an account by R.L. Pelly, the master of St. Nicholas's Hospital from 1957 to 1968, of the hospital's history, entitled The First 7 Centuries. A chapter is devoted to Trollope. It was during the mastership of the good Mr. Howman that an incident occurred which has made our hospital famous. In the story conceived there, the warden is in charge of a hospital, which is in effect a set of almshouses for old people. It stands, quote, on the bank of a river which flows neatly round a cathedral close, being on the side furthest from the town. Anthony Trollope crosses the river by a pretty bridge, and the entrance to the hospital is by this road. Quote, looking from this bridge, the stranger will see the windows of the old men's rooms, each pair of windows separated by a small buttress. A broad gravel walk runs between the building and the river, which is always trim and cared for, and at the end of the walk, under the parapet of the approach to the bridge, is a large and well-worn seat, on which in mild weather 3 or 4 of Hiram's bedesmen are sure to be seen seated. Also to be seen the pretty oriel windows of Mr. Harding's picturesque house, which have been enlarged and adorned, and this well-mown lawn. End quote. In all this, we recognize our own hospital, but there are several details in the story which show that Trollope was not attempting to give an exact description of it. But the undoubted fact remains that the picture in the writer's mind was formed when he stood on Harnham Bridge on that midsummer evening. The warden received a very handsome income, though the duties required him, well, the lightest kind. In fact, the office had become, quote, one of the most coveted of the snug clerical sinecures attached to our church, end quote. Trollope tells in his autobiography that at the time of writing there had been a good deal of complaint about such snug sinecures, and he wished to expose this, quote, egregious malversation of charity, end quote. History does not relate whether Mr. Harman, who was master here at the time, ever read Trollope's book, but if he did, he may have felt that he was being unfairly attacked. His income may have been large, but he did not use it for himself. But Trollope was right in calling for reform. The system then enforced by which the master could appropriate all the surplus income of the hospital, however much it might be, was, to say the least, unsatisfactory and open to abuse, Mr. Pelly concedes. A chapter in his history is called Generous Masters. Quote, not all the masters line their own pockets. For instance, the Reverend Edward Emily, who after 10 years from 1783 as master, left the whole of his estate amounting to £6,200 to the bishop to invest for the brethren and sisters of St. Nicholas. And the master who ruled for 55 years, from 1824 to 1878, so was resident when Trollope was musing at the bridge, spent £2,100 on the inmates' rooms and £1,100 on the chapel, while for himself he only took in 20 years a total of £196, 11 shillings and 7 pence. However, the master was assured of a very comfortable income. It was perhaps unkind to notice, says Mr. Pelly, that the next master after the son and the next after him was the brother of the bishop who made the appointment. We should hasten to add that both were excellent masters. The system was changed in 1933 when the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Salisbury decreed that the master should not be entitled to retain the whole of the surplus income of the hospital, but to receive an annual stipend of £350 a year, raised to £400 in 1950. In conclusion, St. Nicholas's Hospital is only a few minutes' walk from Salisbury Cathedral. It is vital to Trollope's story that people can easily drop in for tea at the warden's house, whether to debate the hospital's fate or to court the warden's daughter. In Winchester, Pamela Singleton enjoys pointing out in her lecture to a Salisbury audience the equivalent hospital of St. Cross would have been a mile's walk across muddy fields. In chapter 19 of Barchester Towers, the characters walk through the close behind the grounds of the Bishop's Palace and onto the bridge at the end of the town, from which they look down into the hospital garden, and then go on to climb the hill from which they can get a view of the cathedral before returning by a footpath through the fields. That's the town path used by many living in Harnham to access the centre of Salisbury today by foot or bike. It's provided a favourite view of the cathedral across the water meadows for visitors for centuries, most famously before Trollope, the artist John Constable, making 300 images over 11 years. This masterpiece was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1831. The whole circular walk is a favourite among residents of the city, as long as you can avoid the heavy road traffic. Since Mr. Pelly wrote his history of St. Nicholas's Hospital, there have been at least 3 hotly debated schemes for a bypass, one causing a long-running rift between the then Dean and Bishop. There became another cause célèbre in this city, and is still fondly remembered. Trollope's view of Hiram's Hospital was not improved with time, but the original bridge on the main London to Southampton road, now bypassed, remains with its embrasure for a pedestrian to stand and avoid traffic as he admires the view. Every time we walk over it, I imagine Trollope on the 22nd of May in 1852, standing there, looking down to the river and across the garden to Hiram's Hospital, deep in thought. For discussion, the Warden is enriched to an exceptional degree with social and psychological interest. It combines a serious treatment of urgent contemporary issues with a complex realism of character and setting, which will be the defining feature of the subsequent novels in the Barsetshire series. Nicholas Shrimpton, Introduction to World's Classic Edition. Do you agree with this opinion? What social and psychological interest does The Warden give you? Do you find complex realism in its characters and setting? are there aspects of the novel that pre-echo what we have discussed in recent big reads of other Trollope novels? Thank you.